All right, welcome to the final round of The Floor is Yours. This time we have four teams with us once again. These four teams have qualified from the two preliminary rounds we had. Two teams qualified from each round. We'll be announcing the teams by order of when they'll be from first to last in terms of the speaking order. We'll be starting with the first team. They call themselves the Obnoxious Male Debaters, represented by Ishan speaking for the proposition and Moitrio speaking for the opposition. Qualifying with them in the second round was the Quarantine Queens team, represented by Komal Kohli and Riddhi. Komal Kohli is speaking for the proposition, Riddhi is speaking for the opposition. And qualifying from the first round is Shinjoy and Ave in one team. Shinjoy is speaking for the proposition, and Ave is speaking for the opposition. And the last speaking team is represented by Pranav Bhandari and Yash Pansari. Pranav is speaking, proposing the motion, and Yash is opposing the motion. I would also like to mention that our judges for this debate are Indrajit Banerjee and Soham Chakraborty. Thank you guys for joining, and yeah, best of luck to you all. So we'll be starting with the first speaker, who will have 4 minutes at the start of his speech, and another. Yes.
We'll just be setting a stopwatch. You can.
All right. Just to clarify for the entire flow, everyone has 5 minutes. The first two speakers get 4 minutes at the start and a minute at the end. Just to give them a chance to refute at the end. Otherwise, I think we're ready. Ishan, are you ready with your? Are you ready to speak?
Yes.
All right. So for the first part of your speech, like I said, you have 4 minutes, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Right. So the very first thing which we must understand today is that patriotism is not a binary concept. It is not that patriotism either exists or does not exist. It can exist in different quantities, depending on the particular country or person. And when today's debate talks about the destruction of international relations, it implies an inherent conflict between national interest and global interest. And for such a conflict to exist, and for this debate itself to exist, we must debate under a system in which the quantum of patriotism is sufficiently high to actually warrant a conflict. So a country's self-interest must be at least equal to its international global interest, or of course it can be greater than that. Now, let me also be clear that when the opposition debates today, it must therefore prove that even if a country's national interest overrides its global interest, even under such a scenario for a majority of the countries, international relations can be sustained and will not be destroyed. And on this side of the floor, I will prove that in such a case, it cannot be sustained. Now, for this, let me be clear that also, if the opposition proves today that it is nationalism and not patriotism that leads to destruction, that is not sufficient. They must also prove that in the presence of patriotism, international relations are not destroyed. Right. Moving on. There are various scenarios of an international system which can exist. The first scenario is that there is no established international order, but there is self-interest overriding international interest. In such a scenario, international relations will obviously break down, as can be evidenced by the early 20th century. We must understand that most wars are not fought on a negative platform. You don't fight wars for xenophobic reasons. You fight wars for expansionary reasons. So when there's no international order and you have self-interest, you want to expand your natural resource base, your military base, your revenue base, the international order will break down because wars and conflict will happen. Now, of course, you might say that in the modern world, there is an order. Such wars do not exist. And indeed, it has been an achievement of humanity that there is the establishment of an international order because of which such conflict does not exist. But I will prove that even if there is such an international order, there can be two possible results out of this. Number one, countries either shed their patriotism and the international order remains and the motion stands, or the countries leave the international order which does amount, it leaves the international order and maintains its patriotism, which does amount to a destruction of the international order in that particular case. And I will explain this with two different examples. So the first case is where you shed your patriotism. And for this, I think the recent hydrochloroquine exporting case is a great example. The current international order as it exists mandates that countries' self-interest cannot override their international interest, and therefore patriotism cannot exist. So India was forced to export hydrochloroquine for international relations reasons, and it would have had to export it even if it felt that not exporting it would have benefited them, would have benefited and advanced their self-interest. So in this case, it had to shed its patriotism. And the second case is, of course, where you have to leave the order. And the best example of this is Brexit. In Brexit, what happened? There was a local international order, which was the European Union plus Britain, of course. But Britain's self-interest, their patriotism, and not their nationalism, started to override their EU-wise interest. And therefore, there was no choice. And since they could not shed this patriotism, they had to leave the order, and this international relations also broke down. Thank you. I think.
Yes, you finished dot on time. Thank you for that, Ishan. That was again Ishan Sengupta speaking for the motion. Patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations. Now we'll take his teammate now speaking against the motion, Moitrio.
Questions?
Oh yes, apologies. Yes, we will now be taking questions upon Ishan's speech. We'll be taking two questions from the floor, and then maybe one from the judges if they have one. Is there anyone with a question? Yes. So I think we'll take a question first from Yash Pansari and then move on to Riddhi. Yash.
Oh, so your speech stated that patriotism is destructive to international relations because it supports a country's self-interest. However, if any sovereign state decides to enter into any international relations in the first place, then it is with always the motive of patriotism and an absolute measure of their own self-interest. Where it detriments others' national interest, it becomes nationalism because patriotism is an absolute and not relative term. And therefore, it is only their own confidence in their own national interest and their own support for it, and not their disregard not their disregard for others' confidence. And therefore, how do you support your statements?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that when a country enters an international relationship agreement, it has to do so keeping in mind its self-interest. That is absolutely true. What I instead meant is for such an international order to be maintained, because this debate is a post-international order debate. So we are talking about after the order has been created, because otherwise it cannot be destroyed if an order has not already been created. So once it has been created, for a country to remain in that order, there is a trade-off. Of course, you pool resources, you pool sovereignty, but because of that, you have to give up a certain amount of your self-interest in the while conducting your international relations. That is what I meant to say. You have to shed your patriotism or leave the order.
All right. With that, I think we'll move on to the next question, which is from Riddhi. Yes, Riddhi, your question.
Ishan, you started by talking about how patriotism is non-binary. Patriotism can mean different things in different contexts. And also, I think that, don't you think you contradicted yourself because you're supporting the concept of how patriotism is ultimately destructive in international relations, which in itself is a very absolute statement. With regards to what you said about it being non-binary, why are you ignoring examples like the Vietnam War, where countries undergoing post-colonial countries have stood up for themselves through patriotism and ignoring that completely in the face of expansionary powers like the US and the UK?
Okay, so first of all, when I say that patriotism is not binary, I do not mean that it can mean different things. What I mean is that it can be of different quantities. So country A can be more patriotic than country B, and country C can be more patriotic than both of these two other countries. I do not mean that it can mean different things. And I just mean it's different quantities. And when you're talking about the Vietnam War, you're absolutely right. It was Vietnam, a post-colonial country, which was establishing its own self-interest when it fought the war against expansionary powers. But because of this patriotism, international relations between Vietnam and the West did break down. So that is an example for the motion, not against the motion.
Right. With that, I think we've wrapped up the questions from the floor, and we'll be checking back with the judges. Do either of you have a question?
You have a question? Cool. Ishan, when you say that there are two circumstances in the modern world where, sticking to your first circumstance where you shed your patriotism, you give the example of the recent drug export case. Tell me why, when you're exporting drugs and where you are sort of preventing either retaliation, or B, whether you're trying to create a good friend out of a dire circumstance, tell me in that situation why patriotism or the lack of it is harmful to your international relations.
Right. So when we talk about self-interest at a national level or at an individual level, I think there has to be a line which we have to draw. So I'll give you an example at an individual level, right? Now this explanation might be a bit long because I hope that's okay, because the question is...
As long as you stick to the time.
Yeah. So for instance, individual self-interest. Traditionally speaking, all economic models used to say that individuals are self-interested. Then there was psychological studies which say that we are not acting according to self-interest. Now, one obvious answer to this is, so I'll give you an example. If instead of eating something, I donate money to charity, right? That is supposedly an example of non-self-interest. Now, a lot of people would say that it's not, because while I donate money to charity, I'm doing it because it makes me happy, right? So now the problem with such a categorization is that the notion of self-interest becomes a tautology. So everybody and everything becomes self-interested, and the category of self-interest, and in this case, the category of patriotism itself becomes irrelevant. Because in such a circumstance, everybody is acting according to self-interest. There is no distinction between selflessness and selfishness. So the concept itself breaks down. So we have to look at a narrower definition of self-interest so that the category actually remains relevant.
All right, thank you.
Right. With that, I think we've wrapped up the questions and answers on this speech. With that, thank you, Ishan. Your next 1 minute will be given to you at the end of the speakers list. With that, we'll be now moving on to your teammate, Moitrio Das. Moitrio, like Ishan, you have 4 minutes for the first part of the speech.
Wait, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Are you
ready?
Is
my network glitching?
No, I think we can hear you clearly.
Moitrio, before you start, Moitrio, just a minute. Listen, can you, Shreyansh, can you repeat the motion once?
The motion says, states that the House believes that patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations. All right. With that, we'll now be moving on to Moitro's speech, speaking again, opposing the motion. Moitro, you have 4 minutes on the clock, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so obviously, of course, I won't plot the generic path and elucidate the differences between patriotism, nationalism, and how one is positive, and you can be skeptical and look at the bad messages of the government, and in other cases, competitive and negative. Now, I do acknowledge that what my teammate said is correct, that it's a debate of self-interest versus global interest. So let's speak of self-interest. Now, understand that in any relationship, be it an international relation between two countries, two blocks, normal relation between two communities, the most volatile and the most basic relationship, which is the relationship between two human beings. International community is just a construct. Now, when I think of the relationship, we all constantly see these love quotes and relationship advices where they say that have some self-esteem, have some self-worth, have a say in the relationship for the relationship to function properly. Why do they say that? It's because any relationship in the world functions on the concept of consensus and a trade-off of interest in the first place. Now, a perfect relationship would be a 50-50 trade-off, a status quo, which in today's political and economic scenarios in the dystopian real world is not possible. So it is a 60-40 in a lot of cases. But there will be a percentage of you, an extent of you expressing your own self-interest and demanding respect for it. Now, understand that in both the analogies, in the analogy of, let's say, my girlfriend, if my girlfriend cannot impose her self-interest and constantly caters to just mine, she ultimately gets demoted to a servant and not a girlfriend. And similarly, in the international community, in a, let's say, UN committee, if we are debating on any treaty of international order and one country X is allowed to express their demands from that treaty, their interests, and another country is not, then then it is not an international relation in the first place. So understand that. Now, if your gradient of patriotism, as Ishan mentioned, if your gradient of patriotism is very high, let's call it nationalism for today. If that is very high, then the problem is you start to treat the Paris Climatic Pact as a Treaty of Versailles, and you say stuff like that country is allowed to do this, that country is allowed to do that. So why won't I, as a superior economy? And that is where international relations and international alliances take a hit. Now understand that the other keyword when I trisect today's motion, the other keyword which comes out is ultimately. Now ultimately essentially means eventually. Now international relation, the concept of international community, international politics was not introduced yesterday. It has existed for a considerable time. So we have two options. We can either look back, we can either realize that it has been countries with very nationalistic, rather high gradients of patriotism, countries like China, Russia, and USA, who have more frequently caused international standoffs and led down to international relations, international treaties, alliances, and not countries like, let's say, Australia or Belgium or Canada, which have never had extremist and nationalistic governments. Or we have another option, that is we draw hypothetical and predictive curves of what can happen 100 years from now. And if sometime from now can actually destroy and be destructive with regards to international relations. So you will have to decide which you deem more substantial, my conclusion in hindsight or their conclusion in hypothesis. So with that, I would like to rest my case by just, the basic fundamental of this debate, regardless of international relations or whatever, the basic fundamental is that a trade-off and consensus and expressing one's self-interest, and that's the building constructive block of any relationship and not a destructive element. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, with that, with 10 seconds left in your speech, we will now be looking forward to questions from the floor and then move on to the judges. Seeing as there is two, right? So we'll start with Srinjoy and then move on to Riddhi.
Your mic is turned off.
Srinjoy, your mic is.
Turn it on.
Yeah, I did turn it on. My bad, sorry. So you talked about how in an international forum, if one country is given priority over another country, it will end up destroying the relationship, as you called it. But so considering that arguably in international forums today that is a very prevalent and existent matter, do you not believe that in that case ultimately the international relations are getting destroyed, and this is evidently going against the stance which you have taken up in this debate?
No, not actually. There are two things. Firstly, I had mentioned in my speech that it's not 50-50 in today's world. USA, France, Russia, China will get a bigger say due to political and economic circumstances. That was the first thing. Secondly, which you said about certain countries getting, let's say, less speaking time in UN or less priorities while getting recognized while speaking of their interests. You have to understand that even in MUN or in real UN sessions, when there are smaller countries which do not get recognized, what they do is they form blocks and use those blocks to express their interest. So somehow or the other, they do get to express their self-interest in whatever quotient. And it's never 50-50. I've never allegedly said that it's a 50-50. It cannot be in today's dystopian world, in a real-life political scenario. But every country, even countries like Chad and Zimbabwe, do get to express their opinions and their self-interest through themselves or their country bloc alliances when deciding an international treaty. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for your question, Shinjo. Thank you for that answer, Matteo. And I'd like to remind the participants that there is a 30-second cap on how long you can ask questions for, and it takes a minute to and the person answering has a minute to answer it. So in this scenario, I think we will let it pass because it's the first time. But from next time, I would request you to keep to these time restrictions. Otherwise, the judges will take it upon themselves to adjust their marking accordingly. With that, we will move on to the next question from Riddhi. Riddhi, your question.
Moitra, I just wanted to ask you that while on the one hand you have conceded to the fact that this trade-off or consensus that you've talked about is not between equals, and there are smaller countries, there are less funded countries, there are less countries with less resources, which are not equal to countries like the USA, the UK, or any other larger or richer country. While you're making this consensus, while you're agreeing to this statement, why are you still justifying the fact that they just because they form blocks, why are you ignoring that larger countries cannot form blocks which are even more powerful, like blocks like Russia and China, blocks like larger blocks in the United Nations, which have an equal way of enforcing of being forceful on smaller countries. These blocks can, in their capacity, also force things or coerce smaller countries or smaller blocks into
Riddhi,
taking
there is a
steps which.
30-second cap and you have
Sorry.
reached almost a minute.
Right. I think Moitra got my question.
So basically, it's the same question as his with more information. You have to understand that yes, of course, a China-Russia bloc will be bigger than, let's say, a SAARC bloc or any other bloc. But like, I do not even want to repeat my answer. As I said, there is no status quo in the world right now. But how does that take away from the fact that even China and Russia do not unilaterally, as a bloc, get to decide treaties? Even when, if there is, let's say, China and Russia, if you go to such a bigger picture, when you go to the absolute the biggest countries, then the world gets divided almost into two halves. And while China and Russia, they express their own, powerful opinions through their blocks, there will be another bloc, USA, France, and United Kingdom, which will oppose it, and through the interests of their bloc and the countries allied to USA, France, and UK. So at the end of the day, there is a trade-off, and as I said, trade-off is the fundamental block of a relationship. So there is a trade-off regardless of regardless of the magnitude. Trade-off here is a scalar term. I've referred to it in a very
Moitro,
scalar
you
manner.
have
So
crossed your
level
1 minute limit.
between two sections. Yeah, sorry.
Uh,
So I
judge-
think you got it. Regardless of the magnitude and level.
Judges, note that this time bar has been crossed, and yeah, with that, we'll be moving on to the judges to see if they have a question. Moitro, sorry, Indrajit or Soham. All right. Soham, your mic is muted. Right, carry on.
So Moitro, just a small two-part question. Is there a difference between rational self-interest on behalf of a nation and patriotism-driven self-interest? And B, do you see how that affects negotiations and trade-off in the global order?
Yes. So I'm opposing the motion, and you must understand that yes, a part of my speech was the fact that, of course, that very gradient of patriotism goes to a level where we can call it a nationalistic set of interests. Obviously, there is a difference between. Obviously, there will be a big difference. That is a very important stance of the opposition as a whole. That, of course, the gradient of patriotism, if it's patriotic interest or nationalistic interest, will have a very big effect, and that is actually our point as an opposition, and that is a very important part of our stance today. So,
right. Does that answer your question, Soham?
Just a second. Can you repeat the motion for me once?
Right. The motion reads: the House believes that patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah. So we are opposing that. It's not patriotism; it may be nationalism. So
Soham, there was no
our
reason for you to interrupt there. Your answer has been mentioned already. Anyway, with that, we will now be moving on to the next speaker. It is now the team of the Quarant Queens. We'll be starting with their proposition speaker, Komal Kohli, for the next 5 minutes. Komal Kohli, are you ready?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. All right.
Should I start?
Yes, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you. So today's motion reads that patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations. Now, considering the fact that patriotism means the quality of being patriotic or devotion to and vigorous support for one's country, we have to take this meaning or take these connotations of patriotism and put it into the current world scenario of the 21st century and the international relations and the international and global order of the 21st century, the late 2010s and the 2020s. Now, why does this affect today's motion? It affects today's motion because in today's scenario, patriotism in all its meaning and with all its connotations is something which has been weaponized by multiple governments around the world to rouse sentiments for government action in various places, whether it's United States war in the Middle East or the Indo-Pakistan disputes. Now, what we have to understand is that we have to look at this word patriotism in this context, because no matter what side opposition might say today and tell you that it is not patriotism but nationalism, what they have to understand that something called the patriotic prejudice or the us versus them sentiment is a byproduct of patriotism. And because of the fact that the us versus them sentiment or the patriotic prejudice is a byproduct of patriotism, this byproduct is exactly what is ultimately destructive to international relations, thus in whole making patriotism ultimately destructive to international relations. Now I will tell you in three ways how patriotic prejudice and ultimately patriotism is destructive towards international relations: political, economic, and social perspectives. Starting with the political perspective, we have to understand that because of this us versus them sentiment, because of this patriotic prejudice, there are territorial disputes, there are land disputes, whether it's the South China Sea, the Indo-Pakistan dispute, the Indo-China dispute over the Siachen Glacier or the Arctic seabed dispute. These territorial disputes go ahead and actively destroy international relations, actively destroy the peace and harmony that various international organizations strive for. Secondly, the economic aspect. We have to understand that we live in the era of globalization. And living in this era of globalization, where there's a world market, a world economy, a world market for jobs and industries, economic cooperation, world economic cooperation is extremely necessary. But because of this self-interest that arises as a result of this us versus them sentiment, as a result of this patriotic prejudice, this self-interest is what goes ahead to hamper the complete global economic scenario. And if this in this era of globalization where economic cooperation is so important, this goes ahead and destroys and is destructive ultimately to international relations. And lastly, when we come to the social perspective, it this us versus them sentiment it goes ahead and creates feelings of xenophobia, feelings of cultural and religious bigotry, feelings of nationalistic bigotry, and the creation and this us versus them sentiment goes ahead and creates mistrust. This mistrust is something which is extremely harmful and destructive to international relations and international cooperation as a whole. And this is created by that vigorous support for one's country that patriotism so prescribes. Now, what we have to understand is that when side opposition comes up and says that it is simply an exchange and what we have to understand that there is a difference between what countries exchange amongst each other or what decisions countries come to as a result of rationally understanding the situation and doing things to keep up the international order, and when countries take steps to preserve their own sense of patriotism, preserve their own self-interest at the cost of others. And when we look at the world economic scenario today, when we look at the world political scenario today, whether it's India or the United States or the United Kingdom, these countries have gone ahead, put their self-interest before the international
1 minute
order,
to
and
go.
thus patriotism has actively aided in the destruction of international relations and the international order. What we also must understand is that when these countries go ahead and put their self-interest before, this is simply a byproduct of patriotism and not something which needs to be confused with nationalism. It is something that arises from the us versus them sentiment, something that arises out of patriotic prejudice. And thus, when opposition says that we are confusing patriotism with nationalism, that argument falls flat on its face, because this is not nationalism. It is a byproduct of patriotism, being patriotic prejudice and the us versus them sentiment. Thus, today, considering the motion has the word ultimately in it, it is absolutely in the purview of side proposition to go ahead and say that along with patriotism comes
10
patriotic
seconds.
prejudice, and thus motion stands true that patriotism ultimately leads to destruction in international relations. Thank you.
Well, with the pinpoint ending, thank you, Komal Koli. We will now be looking for two questions on a speech from the participants. We will first recognize Ave and then move on to Indrajit.
One question from participants.
Two questions. I recognized Ave and you.
Oh, right.
Ma'am,
Bob having slips of tongue is really, really
am I
confusing.
audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, ma'am, in the definition of nationalism, it is clearly specified that the identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. So that's that's the exact definition of nationalism. Don't you believe that this us versus them concept is enshrined within the definition of nationalism, and that patriotism has absolutely nothing to do with it?
Right. So to answer your question, I would like to say that's where you're wrong. It is enshrined in nationalism. However, it stands to be a byproduct of patriotism, thus being called patriotic prejudice and the us versus and the creation of the us versus them sentiment. It is not something which is absolutely and only restricted to nationalism. It is something which is the byproduct of patriotism. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. We will now move on to Ishan's question. Ishan.
Right. So the logic, today's motion states that patriotism leads to destruction of international relations. So you are assuming that patriotism always leads to prejudice and nationalism and us versus them, which leads to destruction. So does that mean that whenever there is patriotism, there is always going to be patriotic prejudice? Are you saying that patriotism cannot exist without prejudice?
Right. So I understand your question. However, what we cannot rule out as side of proposition today is that we cannot rule out that there will never be any scenario where patriotism does not come along with patriotic prejudice and the us versus them sentiment. So even if in 100% of the cases the patriotic prejudice is not a byproduct of patriotism, in many cases it is a byproduct of patriotism, and thus patriotism as a concept, even if in half or 50% of cases in the world gives way to patriotic prejudice, is still ultimately destructive to international relations. Thank
you. Right. Thank you, Kamal Kohli. Thank you, Ishan. With that, do the judges have a question for Kamal Kohli? Soham or Indrajit?
Do you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. Do you, Soham?
No.
All right. Well, I think it's only fit to move on to the next speaker in that case, which is Kamal Kohli's teammate, Riddhi.
Suraj, I have a clarification.
Yes, Riddhi.
Are you going to give me some kind of an indication at 1 minute or 30 seconds to go?
I will call out 1 minute to go when you have a minute left.
Okay, cool.
All right. So with that, Riddhi, for the next 5.
I'm so sorry to cut you in, and I'm really sorry to do this. Kamal Kohli, would you be open to taking a question?
Yeah, sure.
Only if you're open. Otherwise, like.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah. Could you, in 2 sentences, distinguish between nationalism and patriotism for me, so that I better understand like your stance? Just distinguish.
Right. So patriotism is the vigorous love and support for one country. While nationalism is when that vigorous love and support for one country goes to the point of hating others. But the crux of my argument is that a byproduct of patriotism stands to be patriotic prejudice, which also has the same concepts as nationalism does. So even if today nationalism is not something that we're talking about, we are still talking about patriotic prejudice, which very much exists as a byproduct of patriotism.
Fair. Okay, thank you so much.
All right. With that, now we will move on to Riddhi's speech, who is speaking against the motion. Riddhi, like I said, for the next 5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Switch on your mic.
Switch on your mic, Riddhi.
Right.
We'll restart your timer. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to start by talking about how the concept that patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations, or that international relations and patriotism have any kind of negative effect on each other is this argument that had been used by alt-right totalitarian fascist dictators like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini in their foreign policy when they said that international relations cannot exist at the same time as patriotism can. Side proposition today has taken back to these outdated ideas of what patriotism stands for, of what nationalism stands for, and I'm here to reject this reductionist and outdated perspective. Therefore, today I'm opposing this motion. I want to start by dissecting my argument into two parts, right? In the first part, I'm going to tell you how patriotism is not ultimately destructive to international relations. In the second part of my argument, I'm going to tell you how patriotism, in its small way, can in fact help in international relations in a lot of situations. So from the first perspective, I'm going to talk about how making the blanket statement or a blanket generalization that patriotism always leads to destruction of international relations is not something that we can stand for as a house. The motion here is a blanket generalization and does not take into consideration how different countries perceive patriotism differently. We need to understand that while Ishan said that patriotism can be binary and non-binary in terms of how extensive it is, it can also be binary and non-binary in terms of quality. Patriotism can mean different things in different countries with regards to their ethnicities, with regards to their homogeneities racially, linguistically, culturally, and patriotism means a different thing in each and every different country. So, for example, patriotism means a different thing in USA than it does in India because of the obvious differences between the population and demographics of these countries. Therefore, we cannot as a house accept the statement or the generalization that patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations, the keyword here being ultimate. I would also like to make a conceptual clarification between nationalism and patriotism and explain it a little bit better because the previous speaker was not able to do so. I think that the difference between patriotism and nationalism is that saying that I will stand up for my national flag means that I am patriotic. Saying that I will stand up for my national flag and trample somebody else's national flag is nationalism. Patriotism is, in a very literal sense, love for one's country. Nationalism is when your ethnicity and state sovereignty fuse together to make it a very intrinsic part of your identity. And by this, I'm not demeaning how intrinsic patriotism is to your identity, but nationalism is what leads to war. Nationalism is what leads to prejudice. Nationalism and other reasons like religious xenophobia, religious prejudice, ethnic prejudice, these are the things that lead to an us versus them concept. So I do not believe that patriotism is ultimately destroying international relations. I believe that it is a false correlation of equivalence. Moving on to the second part of my argument, I want to talk to you about how patriotism can help international relations. Because of the concept of respect for sovereignty, which is something every single international relations organization has in its very framework. The UN, the SARC, the NATO, the EU, everything accepts the respect for sovereignty and the respect for a country and the patriotism of its people to its country. And therefore, I don't understand how when something is so intrinsically related to international relations and their framework, that it can have a detrimental effect on international relations as a whole. Saying that nationalism is the same as patriotism is the same as saying that democracy is a failed concept because of corrupt democratic systems in certain countries. It's the same as saying that religion is a flawed concept because certain religious institutions are problematic in itself. You cannot I don't believe that this house can equate two concepts and say that just because one is conceptually leading to prejudice is that it is the ultimate destroyer of international relations. I also want to talk about how respect for sovereignty gives smaller countries, post-colonial countries like India and Africa, self-respect and ability to represent their international policy better. I think in situations like when the non-alignment movement was created, African countries and India came up to stand for themselves, used the concept of patriotism, used the concept of self-interest to propagate themselves better in the international sphere without any kind of coercion by a different bloc. So when Ishan says that Vietnam War led to a breakdown of international relations between Vietnam and USA, he very conveniently leaves out the fact that the Vietnam War also
That's time.
huge boom. Okay, I'll just conclude. the Vietnam War also gave a huge boost to Vietnam's international relations, to Vietnam's personal foreign politics and foreign relations. I think I systematically oppose the motion. Thanks.
All right, with that, thank you, Riddhi. We will now be moving on to questions on this page. We will begin with Pranav Bhandari and then move on to Ishan Gupta and then see what the judges have to say. Ishan, your question. Pranav, your question.
Thank you for your speech, ma'am. You very clearly explained to us the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism is essentially patriotism plus crushing somebody else's flag, right? But given that the motion is in an absolute state, and when you address the word ultimately, it need not be that you are going out with the interest of crushing somebody else's flag, but at some point of time or the other, your interest will clash with another countries, right? And this will lead to conflict, which is detrimental to foreign relations. So how do you keep this correlation in place?
Thanks for your question. I think that it's very important to understand that love for one's country does not ever mean that I will clash with somebody else's love for their country. I think patriotism as a concept has nothing to do with being jingoistic or hyper nationalist in any kind of way. And patriotism as a concept, which is what we're discussing today, as a philosophical concept, will never ever hamper international relations, especially not in a context of a motion which says that it will ultimately destroy international relations in the long run or qualitatively, whatever, that's open to interpretation.
Right. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. With that, we'll move on to the next question from Ishan Gupta. Ishan, your question.
While I will ignore that you think a hardening of the Cold War was a betterment of international relations, my question is directed towards you, talking about SAARC, etc. Do you realize that by the very definition of any country's grouping or any regional grouping, these countries give up some amount of sovereignty,
I can't hear. Can you repeat that question?
Ishan, for Riddhi's benefit and to get an answer more clearly, can you repeat your question once again?
Yes. So you talk about how SAARC is essentially, SAARC and other such groupings promote sovereignty, promote patriotism. But do you realize the very definition of any such regional grouping or any such grouping of countries is that you give up some amount of control over your own resources, your own policy, your own sovereignty, so as to pool together your resources, pool together your sovereignty, etc. So self-interest, self-resources, independence is antagonistic to any such regional grouping.
Thanks for that question, Ishan. I'll first tell you that I did not in any way say that the betterment or improving of Cold War tensions has anything to do with what I said. You took a sentence out of context and changed the meaning of it completely. I said that patriotism and respect for one's sovereignty helps to improve that particular country's respect in the foreign sphere. For example, a country like Vietnam, which did not have a huge amount of respect due to its past colonial history. I'm sure you know that it was colonized by Japan and China and Russia and France and almost every other country in the world. I'm sure you know that they did not have a huge lot of respect in the international sphere, and their patriotism or their fighting up for their rights genuinely and intrinsically improved the quality of respect that they have in the international sphere. Even if I ignore that out of context question, I think that your question about sovereignty and pooling together is also very misplaced, because firstly, I gave you the example of the non-aligned movement, right? I gave you the example of NAM. If you knew the history of NAM, you would understand that in that point in history, India and African countries came together because they were feeling like during the Cold War, they did not want to be aligned to any large bloc. They were standing up for themselves. There was nothing about pooling resources.
You have greatly crossed your time bar for this answer.
She asked a twofold question, so I was trying to answer it to the best of my capacity.
You've taken almost double.
Okay, I'll wrap it up. I think that no, even if you pool your resources, even if you believe in collective security, that has nothing to do and is completely irrelevant to the patriotism that you have for your country. And the respect for sovereignty is an essential part of SAARC, EU, and almost every other international organization. As long as there is sovereignty, there is a great respect for patriotism. I think that answers your question.
All right. With that, We will take a question from the judges if they have one.
Yeah. So, Vidhi, in your speech, you mentioned how patriotism means different things for different countries, and hence we cannot generalize. However, you don't give any examples for me to make a conclusive judgment. Can you take this time to explain to me what are these situations where, and what are these examples of countries where patriotism arises? It is good, it is cooperative, and it results in positive things, keeping in mind the fact that the NAM example that you give is a little flawed, because all different African countries, usually post-colonial nations, ended up being uh, ethnic war zones in Africa. So most of those countries are not great examples. So keeping in mind that, could you give me any example around the world of cooperative patriotism that has arisen?
Okay. So what I said about patriotism not being binary was with respect to the fact that the motion today is a blanket statement, right? It says patriotism is ultimately destructive in international relations. So I'm saying that in a situation where patriotism means different things for different countries, I'll elucidate that with an example. For example, if we're talking about patriotic prejudice, which somebody before me spoke about, patriotic prejudice means very different things for a country like India, which has huge ethnocentric differences, and a country like, say, France, or any other country like Poland, where there aren't a huge number of ethnocentric differences or religious differences or racial differences. It means different things for USA, right? So I believe that I'm not saying that patriotism is always positive. I'm not saying patriotism is always negative. I'm saying that such a motion cannot be debated because of the inherent flaw within it, which says that patriotism always ultimately destroys international relations.
All right, with that, we've wrapped up the line of questioning on Riddhi's speech. Thank you, Riddhi. Thank you
Thanks.
to those who asked the questions. With that, we'll now move on to the next team. The next team is the team of Shinjoy and Avya. Shinjoy will be starting it off, proposing the motion. Shinjoy, are you ready?
Right, I'm audible.
Yes, you are. All right, with that, you have 5 minutes on the clock. Your time starts now. The floor is
Right.
yours.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, the main premise today on which side opposition has based their argument is the fact that patriotism and nationalism are two parallels and that they are two very different concepts. But, ladies and gentlemen, what we must analyze here is that this patriotism and this nationalism, which side opposition claims to be two completely different concepts, are they mutually exclusive? The answer is they are not. Because what is nationalism? As put forward by side opposition themselves, nationalism is identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, even at the detriment of other nations. So when we say identification of one's nation, that inherently implies that a patriotic love for one's nation is present. Therefore, the point I'm trying to put across in this argument is that a patriotic person need not always be nationalistic in nature, but a nationalistic person will definitely contain the qualities of patriotism. Therefore, we see that there are always going to be cases in which patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations. And, ladies and gentlemen, in this context, I feel it is very important to look at the word ultimately, which is present in the today's motion. What the word ultimately implies is that it is not necessary that the patriotism directly leads to a destruction of international relations, but even if we can bring about the fact that patriotism indirectly leads to a destruction of international relations, even in that context today's motion will stand. Now, ladies and gentlemen, understand that if we are able to bring about the assertion that nationalistic people are necessarily patriotic, in that case we will understand that the nationalism that the side opposition are also claiming are destructive to international relations is being brought about by people who are also patriotic. Therefore, even indirectly, patriotism is destructive to international relations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we come to the concept of jingoism, now according to Oxford Dictionary, ladies and gentlemen, jingoism is extreme patriotism, especially in the form of aggressive or warlike foreign policy. It is extreme patriotism, not extreme nationalism, and this is according to Oxford Dictionary. Therefore, we can clearly see that in such cases, even patriotism is leading to a destruction of international relations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we analyze the second speaker for side opposition, she believed that fascist governments believe that patriotism and international relations cannot exist, and therefore, if we were to say that they cannot exist, we would basically be behaving like fascist governments. Now, firstly, to say that fascist governments believe that patriotism and international relations cannot coexist itself, the statement is flawed, because understand that the governments she brought up, Mussolini had international relations with Germany, Stalin had international relations with Cuba. Therefore, the entire statement is fallacious. But ladies and gentlemen, understand that when we say that patriotism ultimately is destructive to international relations, it again does not imply that each and every international relationship is destroyed. It means that as a whole, international relations with other countries will get destroyed. For example, the United States of America recently backed out of the Paris Agreement. We all know. Now, what happened
One
in this
minute.
1 minute, fair enough. So what happened in this case was that the governments of some of its closest allies actually came out and criticized the United States government for this action of theirs. Therefore, we can see that an action that was committed by the United States of America on the patriotic belief on the that it was affecting their industries. Therefore, this is for the love of their own country and for their own self-interest, is actually leading to a deterrent in their international relations. Understand that today India has a very large proportion of the Ganges river flowing through it. Now, say we want to think only about the benefit of our country because we are feeling patriotic and we feel that we should not let this water go into Bangladesh. Now, we are acting which as what is according to us in our patriotic sentiments, but this will eventually lead to a deterrence in the international relations. We again look at examples like the export of hydroxychloroquine. Now, understand that when India had initially banned the export of this drug, which is believed that it might be helping in the cure of coronavirus, it was done in the patriotic sentiment because India believed that
Shinjoy,
its
wrap up.
concluding statement, India believed that its own citizens should come first, but eventually it did have to modify the stance because it did not want the deterrence of international relations with United States. And if it had persisted,
Shinjoy.
concluding statement, if he had persisted with this patriotic sentiments, then the international relations would have been deterred.
All right, that's it. That's it. Shinjoy, to all, a request to all speakers, please do not go over the time bar. Now we'll be recognizing questions. We'll start with Yash and then move on to Moitreyo.
All right, so Shinjoy, you stated in your speech, as many proposition speakers have stated, that use the word ultimately and therefore moved on to say that if patriotism indirectly leads to nationalism, then that is ultimately destroying foreign policy. However, what do you not think that if the word ultimately could also mean that if patriotism causes some degree of constructive properties and some degree of destructive properties, then your perception of the word ultimately does not stand anymore, and therefore patriotism becomes ultimately constructive and not destructive to foreign relations.
Sir, could you please repeat your perception of ultimately as you put it?
Oh, yes, sir. You perceive ultimately as if it leads to nationalism, then it is ultimately destructive. However, if it causes some degree of constructive effects on foreign relations and some degrees of destructive effects on foreign relations, then is it not ultimately constructive and not destructive? If the constructive effects outweigh the destructive effects.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, when arguing about whether the constructive effects actually outweigh the destructive effects, till now in today's debate, not a single valid example has come across where this patriotism is actually leading to constructive effects. Now, understand, ladies and gentlemen, again, as has been put in front of us, patriotism may or may not have many meanings. As other debaters before me have also expressed, patriotism may be binary or patriotism may be non-binary. However, today we are considering patriotism as a whole. So as a whole, is it ultimately destructive or not? So we see plenty of examples throughout history, and understand that today, when I have made it clear that under the context of patriotism, nationalism, jingoism, and other such contexts are also being included due to the reasons I've already put forward, I believe that it will definitely, the destructive effects will outweigh the constructive effects.
All right, with that, we will move on to the next question from Moitrio. Moitrio, your question. Moitrio, you can't be heard.
It's muted.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
sir, you gave an example of how India, for its self-interest, might stop the Ganges from going in, stop the Ganges from going into Bangladesh and all. So, you do realize, right, that in that very self-interest, if I consider that the government is actually run by 16-year-olds like us, and they are foolish, and they want their self-interest of the water, and do you realize that with that very self-interest, we have a Brahmaputra river pact with Bangladesh, and because of that self-interest, we actually do have international, we do actually do have international ties with Bangladesh regarding the Brahmaputra river. That same self-interest you use as a hypothetical example to back your arguments that self-interest lead to destruction of international ties.
Right.
Note that the time bar for this question was crossed by 7 seconds. Carry on.
Right. So your argument in this question perfectly coincides with my argument when I said that countries are striving to find a balance and to not let this patriotism come in the way of their decisions. I am saying that if such a pact, if we had not allowed the water to flow into Bangladesh, or as you proposed, if Bangladesh had not allowed the water to come into India, it would be letting the patriotic feelings, the patriotic sentiments of these Indians make their decisions for them. Similarly, in the case of the hydrochloroquine drug, if we had allowed our patriotic sentiments to make our decisions, in that case it would have been destructive to our international relations, because patriotism is ultimately destructive to our international relations. But if, as India has done, to not deter international relations, they have not let the patriotic sentiments come in the way, and therefore international relations have not been deterred. Thank you.
All right, with that, we have come to the end of the participants' side of questioning on Srinjoy's speech. We will now move on to see if the judges have a question. Right.
Srinjoy, thank you for your speech. So I think you've stressed a couple of times that how these patriotic decisions, like the USA pulling out of the Paris Pact, or the Brahmaputra River water blockage, or so on and so forth, those are destructive for a country. In a world order where foreign policy or international relations exist in a scheme of allies, in a scheme of reciprocity, tell me on what basis are you qualifying any decision to be constructive or destructive? What is your basis of classification, even if it is an oppressive step, even if it's a reprisal? Tell me what is your, yeah, you get my question, right?
Yes, fair enough. So essentially, I what I said was that these patriotic sentiments lead to the destruction of international relations, not are not destructive to a country, because I am not saying what is it affecting the economy of a country maybe, but it is destructive to the international relations specifically of a country. And to support that very same, going into that very same example, I did say about how one of US's closest allies, France, also strongly critiqued that action. So what we can see is that it is having a detrimental effect on the international relations between France and the United States of America. Now, maybe these relations have not yet become non-existent, and I'm not claiming that they will ever become non-existent, but it is having a detrimental effect on it, and it is having a destructive effect on it, which is why the French premier actually has critiqued the United States, its closest allies' decision, on international television.
All right, thank you.
All right, so with that, we have the line of questioning on this speech has expired. We will now move on to Shinjoy's teammate opposing the motion. Patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations. Ave Tulsian, are you there?
Yeah.
Right. So for the next 5 minutes, Ave, the floor is yours.
All right. So the proposition seems to misunderstand the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Despite the fact that the opposition continues to bring it up, they continue to think that patriotism and nationalism are interchangeable concepts, which of course they are not. Patriotism simply denotes a love for one's country, and there is a clear line in the sand between the concepts of patriotism and nationalism. When we consider this us versus them mentality, that is when we go from patriotism to nationalism. Nationalism, when you support the interests of your nations to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations, that is when you go from patriotism to nationalism. There is a clear line, and it would be very helpful if the proposition would understand that. Now, the proposition again in the speaker just before me said that or tried to argue that patriotism ultimately leads to the concept of nationalism, but these two concepts, patriotism and nationalism, can exist independently of each other. I can be a patriotic person, I can love my own country, but that doesn't mean that I want the detriment of other nations for the benefit of my own. There is no requirement of someone being nationalist in order for them to be patriotic. Moving on, I'd like to refute some of the arguments brought up by the first speaker of the proposition. The first speaker as well as subsequent speakers of the proposition spoke about the export of hydrochloroquine and said that it was a case of India shedding its patriotism. But I believe that the patriotism is a continuous concept. A nation cannot be considered patriotic or unpatriotic simply on the basis of a singular incident. Furthermore, you cannot equate ceding to a request from another nation or other nations to a lack of patriotism. Now, the first speaker of the proposition made the argument that you have to shed your patriotism in order to remain in the international order. But, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that all nations in the current international order have some level of patriotism within them, and yet they continue to exist in the national order without any detriment to the international relations. Furthermore, simply ceding to a request or working with other nations, particularly in this case for humanitarian aid, is not a shedding of patriotism. The first speaker also said that this debate is a conflict between national interest and global interest. And that when we have more national interests than our global interests, and when we put our national interests above global interests, that is when we go into patriotism, and that there is an inherent conflict between the two. But I would argue that there is no conflict between national interest and global interest, and that these two concepts can coexist, because the very purpose of global interest is to further our own national interests. The only purpose of global alliances which nations make with one another is to further their own national interests, to further their own wants, and to further their own requirements. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition in today's debate is trying to make the argument that simply loving one's nation and supporting it is somehow destructive to international relations, and I don't believe how that argument can ever stand. Ladies and gentlemen, actively supporting one's nation to damage other nations in the form of jingoism or aggressive nationalism is ultimately destructive. I'll give you that. But simply supporting one's nation to make it better and move ahead through patriotism is in no way, shape, or form ultimately destructive. Furthermore, when we talk about this in today's
1 minute to go.
Yeah. In today's debate, we need to take into account the importance of the word destructive. The word destructive in this motion means causing great and irreparable damage to international relations. But the simple concept of patriotism and love for one's nation and wanting one's nation to develop can in no way completely destroy or cause such damage to international relations that it is irreparable in nature. Patriots don't simply support all the decisions and policies of the governments of their nations. It only denotes a special attachment to one's country and not to the current form of government of that country. I'd like to rest my case here.
All right, with that, we will now be moving on to the two questions on his speech. We will start with we will start with Ishan Sengupta and then move on to Pranav from there.
Right. So your definition of nationalistic self-interest is very broad and tautological, right?
I
So
can't hear you. Could you speak louder?
your definition of nationalistic self-interest is extremely broad and it is tautological, right? So if everything a country does is in its nationalistic self-interest, the entire category of actions which are done in global interest ceases to exist. So do you agree that therefore, according to your argument, the entire category of actions which belongs to global interest is irrelevant because everything is done in nationalistic interest, if that broad definition applies?
My argument is that the very purpose of global relations, the reason countries pursue international relations with one another, is for their own interests and for their own national interest. No country is going to form an alliance or pursue better relations with another country if it does not bring some sort of benefit to them, and that is in their national interest. That's my argument.
Okay, I mean, you didn't answer my question.
There was no reason for that line, Ishan. But anyway, we'll move on to the next question now from Pranav.
Thank you, sir, for playing games with the definition of patriotism, where you only told, I just like to point this out before asking a question, where you only told us about the love, whereas patriotism also entails the vigorous support for one's country and its policies. So my question to you is, when one country's priorities fall into place and they reach a crossroads with the priorities and the outlook of another country, a direct offshoot is the conflict because they have a vigorous support for their own policies. So this conflict is detrimental to international relations. And how do you defend this correlation?
Sir, the definition of patriotism is not a support for the policies that the nation is adopting currently. If I can be a patriot yet still disagree with what my country is doing at this point of time. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. If you don't think I got your question, you could repeat it.
No. Let's not, like, I think that's your answer.
Yeah, that's it. I think the judges have heard what they've had to from the question. So I think, it's only fitting that we move on to the judges to see if they have a question on our speech.
Soham, you take this one.
Soham, you can't be heard.
Yeah, Indra, you have a question?
No, you take this one.
Okay. No conflict between national and global interests is a sentence I heard in the speech. Given that immigration and asylum concerns often clash, given that climate change and industrialization concerns often clash, these, as in national versus global interests, often clash. If the mediation between these interests is done not in national interest of the world order, but in terms of patriotism, will it or will it not lead to a destruction of the global order?
Could you repeat your question? I didn't really understand the last part of your question.
My question is simply this. You said that there's no conflict between national and global interests. I gave you two examples. Immigration concerns about low-wage laborers coming into the country and replacing original laborers, and asylum concerns often clash. Climate change concerns often clash with industrialization priorities of a nation. Given that these national and global interests often clash within a country interests, if these disputes are mediated via self-interest for the global order, or if they are mediated via patriotic concerns, which one do you think leads to the destruction of the global order? Yeah.
Sir, I believe when I said that there is no conflict between national interests and global interests, what I meant was that there is no basic existential conflict between the two. That the presence of national interest and global interest, the two concepts can coexist together, and the simple presence of national interest doesn't indicate that doesn't indicate a direct conflict with global interest in every situation. There can be, in some situations, conflicts between national and global interests. But my argument was simply that the presence of national interests and global interests together doesn't inherently necessitate a conflict.
All right. Does that answer your question, Soham?
It's fine.
All right. With that, we will now terminate the line of questioning on our speech and move on to the final group of the finals. The team of Yash Pansari and Pranav Bhandari. Yash, you have 5 minutes on the clock. Are you ready? Oh, sorry. We're starting with Pranav. My bad.
Right.
Pranav is proposing the motion, and yes, you have 5 minutes. Are you ready?
Right.
Right. So, for the next 5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Side proposition would like to dissect every part of today's motion. Firstly, patriotism and not nationalism acknowledged. Secondly, the fact that we have the word ultimately in today's motion, since we are all playing games with this motion. And last but not the least, the fact that it is destructive towards international relations. Now, very simply put, as a citizen of India, for instance, what is detrimental to international relations? War is, if you look up any movies on patriotism, 9 out of the first 10 you will find are based on real actual wars in history or fictional wars, but all on the basis of patriotism. Now, it is understood that this motion is in an absolute state, right? But we are also addressing the fact that the word ultimately is in this motion. Thus, we are addressing that at any future point of time also, this motion still entails, right? So we are considering patriotism even to be detrimental on international relations in a future point of time. So when you talk about the word ultimately, when the views of one country are challenged, drawing a line between patriotism and nationalism becomes very problematic. Because if you support your own interest, whether it is policies or not, if you support the interest of your own nation with the vigor of a true patriot and not a nationalist, a true patriot, that is, when they are challenged, there is bound to be conflict. By the very definition of conflict, you surpass individuals, and that comes at a cost, which is the cost of the other. I will also now try and address the economic aspect, where you will learn this opportunity cost. When you talk of peace, international relations would entail economic trade and economic trade. The basics of economic tell us that there is an opportunity cost involved in every action. When you consider this opportunity cost, for instance, the way China has forced technology transfers, this is a direct result of their policy of technological progress. This is because China has an idea of technological progress, and these forced technology transfers are they create a loss for other countries trying to trade in the premises of China. As a result, firstly, this is a direct loss for other nations, and secondly, this is an opportunity cost in the form of severed international relations with other countries, as is seen very clearly with the US and the China trade war and the number of tariffs imposed. This is a direct result of the patriotic nature of the Chinese and their approach towards technological process. Now, I would also like to address the fact that I'd like to reprimand the third speaker of side opposition for addressing patriotism as only the love, right? There is also a vigorous support. The problem when talking about patriotism and nationalism is that it is a game of definitions, which is very well for the sake of debating. But when you're talking about a real world concept, there is no such thing as a clear line that is drawn. This side is patriotism, that side is nationalism. This does not exist as a real world concept. It is a very subjective idea where a patriot's love for one country should stop and address the needs of another country, and where this patriotism inevitably turns into nationalism. So finally, the simple point I'm here trying to make is that conflict is an aggressive form of competition. When there is a vigorous support for one's country, whatever the actions may be, there is always going to be conflict. As a direct result of conflict, in all circumstances, that is to address the absolute state, considering the fact that ultimately is in the motion, when there is going to be a clash of interest, there will be an opportunity cost. This will lead to conflict, and this conflict is the direct detrimental effect on international relations. Here, I'd like to rest my case, but not my stance.
Right. Thank you, Pranav. With over a minute left in your speech, we will move on to questions. Right now, seeing that, who has questions? Right, Riddhi, your question.
Pranav, you very clearly stated that in the real world, the line between patriotism and nationalism does not exist. So, are you implying that the line between state and nation does not exist? Are you saying that because the lines are blurred in the real world, we cannot make a distinction between state and nation? And if so, how do you put into context movements like the Khalistan movement, for example, or any other movement which has been nation led or national identity led and not patriotic led? How are you making that distinction?
Right, ma'am. I don't know this question stands because nowhere in my speech did I say that this line does not exist. I said the problem is that you cannot draw a clear line between patriotism falling on this side, nationalism falling on that side. That in numerous cases this line does get blurred. But I never stated that there is no such thing as a line between nationalism and patriotism, because that would be saying that patriotism and nationalism are the same thing, and this is not what I've said.
I have a follow up.
See,
Let's not go into follow-ups.
all right.
Because we
And
can't mark you, we can't mark.
Okay.
a question to the judges: would you all want to see maybe another question if there is on this speech, seeing as there is an expanse of time?
No, it'd just be unfair on the others, right?
Right. All right. So with that, are there any other questions, or should we move on?
I have a question. If no one has, I have a question.
Yeah. Of course.
Pranav,
Right.
I'll give you a scenario completely based on your speech, right? You talk about how, conflict is a vigorous form of competition, and all conflict has a detrimental effect on international relations. You're a citizen of Pakistan. Now you have blocked your borders and you have captured some territory in India. As a citizen,
I have what my borders? Sorry.
you have blocked your borders to India, you sealed your borders to India, and you have captured some territory of India. What that has led to is that China has hailed your action. China feels that what you've done is amazing. It is great. It is sovereignty. It is self-preservation.
Right.
As a citizen of Pakistan, do you think that where your country is in conflict with India but gets the support of China, would you still stick to your stance that conflict leads to detriment in IR?
Right. So when you talk about international relations, your example stands, right? China supports the action of Pakistan. There will also be repercussions where there are other nations that do not support the actions of Pakistan, and this number will be at large. It will be much larger given that it is against international law. So when you take the idea of international relations, the concept as a whole, it is still detrimental to Pakistan's international relations, keeping in mind the fact that China has hailed these actions. I hope that answers your question.
Right. So with that, we will no longer move into line of questioning on Pranav's speech and move on to his teammate. Oh, Soham has a question.
Yeah. Since we didn't have one question, I thought I'll ask a question.
Sure.
Yeah. So very simple question. You said patriotism equals vigorous support of national priorities. Vigorous support of national priorities leads to conflict. Conflict leads to detriment of interest. Given that the facts on the ground as they exist means that there will always be differences of interest, in which world do you want them mediated? One where there is patriotism or one where there isn't patriotism? Because your argument seems to suggest that conflicts are a problem and conflicts lead to detriment of interest. But conflicts will always exist because countries have different priorities. The question is, how do you mediate conflicts? That's the problem of the global international order. So my question is, which world would you want it mediated? Where countries have no patriotic interests, or in a world where countries have patriotic self-interest?
Right. So when I address patriotism, when I address that correlation, right, patriotism equals conflict equals detriment to international relations. What I am simply trying to say is your example obviously makes sense that even in a world without patriotism, conflict would still exist, right? But point here is patriotism accelerates this process of conflict. A person who has more vigorous interests in their own priorities will lead to faster and larger conflict at large than other countries. If there was a world without patriotism, conflict would no doubt exist, but on a much smaller scale. Point here being that patriotism does lead to detriment in the international relations, and this is basically what I tried to say. But addressing it would obviously be much more of a utopian concept and idealistic if a world existed without patriotism.
Right. Soham, does that answer your question? Right. So with that, we will once again move on to Yash, Pranav's teammate's speech. Yash is speaking for the opposition. Yash, are you ready for the next 5 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So for the next 5 minutes, Yash, the floor is yours.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, as an Indian who considers himself considerably patriotic but not extreme nationalist, I would like to defend the stance and conclude the arguments of the opposition. Now, first of all, I would like to acknowledge how the proposition has been playing with the word ultimately throughout their speeches. Now, what we must realize is that that assumes that patriotism in some way leads to nationalism or extreme nationalism to the extent that it is detrimental or destructive to foreign policy more than it is constructive. However, I believe that this is not the case. If we take the example brought up by several opposition and proposition members of the House, Nazi Germany. Now, I do not believe Nazi Germany resembled any degree of patriotism at all. It was simply brainwashing and extreme nationalism for the simple reasons that the World War was not in favor of Nazi Germany's interests at all. It was only in the favor of Hitler's sentiments and the sentiments that the Nazis were brainwashed into believing. And therefore, it was not in the overall best interests of Germany, and therefore does not qualify for the definition of patriotism at all. Furthermore, moving on, I would like to once more acknowledge that several definitions of patriotism have been brought up in this debate. However, one thing common to them all, that patriotism is the vigorous support or love for a country's overall best interests. Now, I acknowledge that foreign relations in themselves involve a degree of compromise, but however, I must also acknowledge that Ishan was wrong in stating that this compromise involves foregoing one's patriotism. When a country is in a situation where its best interests may collide with another country's best interests, that is the only situation where an us versus them scenario may appear to have been created. However, in that situation, it is often the case that it is still in the country's best interests to compromise on some of their interests and prevail in some of their others, and in fact remain in their foreign relations. And that is the entire concept of foreign relations, taking something in exchange for something else. And therefore, when a country is foregoing some of their interests, they are obviously gaining something on the front of some of their others. And each and every patriotism in itself is ingrained in not only each and every democratic individual of a government, but also the officials who run the government. And therefore, anything a government does is in the nation's best interests and is in fact promoting patriotism. And therefore, even when foreign relations are formed, as an opposition member, I would like to promote the stance that patriotism is not ultimately destructive to foreign relations. However, it is constructive to foreign relations, and patriotism and confidence and support for one's own or country's own self-interests is what promotes a country to form relations with other countries in the first place. For example, as economics has been brought up by my fellow teammate and the proposition member Pranav Bhandari, he stated that the concept of globalization has often been brought up in this debate. However, I must point out that the very reason a country indulges in globalization and international trade is to improve their own economy, and therefore that in itself is an example of patriotism. And foreign relations and patriotism are not mutually exclusive. In fact, one promotes and aids the other. And even though there may be examples where a country's best interests overall, considering all factors, may involve putting down another country's best interests, and however, what we must realize is that with the use of the word ultimately, I would like to state that patriotism ultimately is in fact beneficial to international relations, and in most, if not all cases, patriotism has led to new, better relations being formed instead of weaker ones or conflicts of interest leading to destruction or detrimental traits to international relations and foreign relations. Furthermore, speaking about something Kamal Kohli said, patriotism may lead to patriotic prejudice. However, when there is a conflict of interest between one country and another, we must account for variable change in that scenario. In that particular scenario, the country's best interest changes from supporting their own interests and putting down the other country's interests to supporting their collective interests and therefore surviving better. And that is the entire reason a country indulges in alliances and other such aligned movements. And the judge and several proposition members have also often been asking the opposition members to provide an example of the constructive use of patriotism in international relations oftentimes. And I would like to say we should consider the Alliance of Southeast Asian Nations or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is ASEAN. These countries may be considered small in the global perspective. However, to promote their own self-interest and seeing that their self-interests align with other nations, they have formed an alliance called the ASEAN, which in turn promotes not only their collective interests, but in doing so also promotes their own national and self-interest in the spirit of patriotism. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Yash. With a pinpoint ending to your speech, we will now be looking forward to two questions on his speech. We will start with Shinjoy. Is that a question? All right. We will start with Ishan and wait and see if there's another. Ishan, your question.
My question is similar to what I've already asked to others and not got a reply to, which is that you are saying all global actions or actions which we take which help other countries are done in self-interest. So do you agree that to remain logically consistent with your own arguments, the entire category of actions which are taken in global interest is irrelevant? Just like by your logic, selflessness would be irrelevant because everything is ultimately done for self-interest.
Or can I answer that?
Yes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
of course.
Yeah. So what I would like to point out is that I'm not completely ignoring the concept of global interest. What I'm trying to propose is that when a country acts in seeming global interest, it is indirectly or directly working towards promoting its own national interests together with that. For example, the United States of America contributes to the UN largely. However, this not only promotes the global interest of the UN and the greater good, as you may call it, it also promotes the United States of America's own self-interests and their patriotism and their national interests in doing so.
Right. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. With that, we will take one more question from Kamal Kole.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so Yash, you talked about how there is a very distinct difference between nationalism and patriotism. However, if patriotism is love for one's country and nationalism is a love for one's country while disliking or hating others, how do you reach the point of disliking and hating others without loving your own country? And thus, ultimately, isn't it patriotism at the end? Thank you. Like, answer your question.
What I would like to point out, as I did with the example I used, is nationalism is oftentimes caused by a misconception of the word patriotism and a misconception of a country's own best interests. If an individual or a government was in fact acting in the country's overall best interests, then in most, if not all cases, nationalism would not have arisen in the first place. And furthermore, even nationalism, as I pointed out in my own speech, has two separate entities, which is normal nationalism and extreme nationalism, as in Nazi Germany versus Vietnam.
Right. With that, we will now be looking forward to a question from the judges, if they have one.
Take it, Soham. Go for it.
I'll just pick up on something on your reply to the last question.
Hey, ask him what he said in his speech, man.
I'll just pick it up. It's fine. It's with regards to something you just said, and I think it goes into the tautological trap, because what you have said is just now is that if countries understood their patriotic interests perfectly or national interests perfectly, their actions would never be to the detriment of the global order. But since they don't, the problem is that the misconceptions cause problems and they lead to nationalism and all sorts of different issues. But this is a little bit like saying that, organized religion is all well and good. The problem is that people misinterpret it all the time. So the problem doesn't lie with organized religion or its precepts. It's just that people misinterpret it constantly. I think that the problem here is, if a concept is so my question is essentially that don't you admit then, given by your own explanations, that if a concept is so fluid, that it is so susceptible to misinterpretation, that there is a certain problem in that idea itself, and that idea is open to being used for nefarious purposes?
So what I would like to answer that with is that in my answers previous to the speech and in this speech itself, I have conceded that in some cases promoting a nation's self-interests may involve nationalism and putting down another nation's own interests. However, in most cases, what I stated must be true, because because as we can look back in hindsight, most wars have in fact been detrimental to both parties, even though both may have been thought to work in patriotism. And I believe that extreme nationalism arises not in patriotism but in hate, and this hate is what causes this hate is what in fact causes a misconception of the patriotism and not the fluidity of the concept itself.
All right. Does that answer your question, Soham? All right. So with that sign, we will now move on to the final two speeches, or the final two parts of a speech that was left for Ishan and Moitro. The 1 minute, 1 minute time for the rebuttals. We will begin with Ishan, who was proposing the motion. Ishan, are you ready?
Right.
Right. So Ishan, you have 1 minute on the clock. Are you ready?
Yeah. So the first thing which I want to say is that my argument is not at all contingent on patriotism leading to nationalism. My argument is that patriotism by itself is enough of a destructive force. Secondly, all my opponents or some of my opponents have made the concept of national self-interest way too fluid. They've fallen into the tautological trap, as Soham called it, and made the entire category of global interest or self-interest so fluid that the categories itself stop existing. Now, we must understand a basic conceptual issue with my opponent's arguments, which is that all international or multilateral decisions must be mediated by keeping in mind group interests over self-interest. And this does not amount to patriotism going away. This simply amounts to patriotism taking a back seat. So saying that patriotism still exists is not enough, because it has taken a backseat to global interests. Or if it has not, the country has exited that particular order. Right.
Is that it?
1 minute, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, your time has elapsed just now. Anyway, with that, we will recognize again this time one question on this part of his speech. Does anyone have a question? Seeing that no one has a question, do the judges have a question or two?
You already asked our questions to Ishan.
All right, fair enough. With that being said, we will now move on to Ishan's teammate, ending off the speeches of the obnoxious male debaters with Moitrio. Moitrio, you have a minute on the clock. Are you ready?
Yeah, so majority of the proposition speakers accepted that it was nationalism which was destructive, but they equated that somehow patriotism leads to nationalism. Now, Srinjoy, he says that if someone is patriotic may not necessarily be nationalistic, but someone who is nationalistic is necessarily patriotic. But by that, he contradicts the very motion he's proposing, because that the equation the motion draws, that patriotism leads to nationalism, he invalidates that by saying that it is non-commutative. Pranav says that the conflict of national self-interest leads to the decay of international relations. He's wrong, because that leads to the birth of international relations. If the self-interest did not conflict, then we will not have the very concept of compromise and consensus. And international relations, the concept of international community would not exist at all. And Commonwealth gave instances of South China Sea and unruly decisions made by China, US international scenario, and blamed it on patriotism. But if all of us think of foreign policy as a parameter to judge IR, then we should also consider domestic ones to judge self-interest, and realize that those very governments have also made very erratic, domestic, destructive decisions as
That's
well.
your time.
So it is not really the whether it's not okay. It's not really whether the government is patriotic or not, but it's how the government is at the end of the day.
All right. With that, we will be looking forward to a question from the participants. We will take a question from Shinjoy. Yeah.
Wait, I got it. So you mentioned in your speech that since each and every person who is patriotic is not nationalistic, it does not you cannot say that patriotism is ultimately destructive to international relations. But so do you not believe that if patriotism can lead to nationalism, then it is destructive to international relations, whether or not each and every single patriotic person is nationalistic or not?
No, it is not about each and every. The very fact that right and truth all the years international relations and politics have existed, it's not really, you don't really have the majority here where everyone patriotic have given way to patriotic prejudice and hence nationalism. So you do not have the majority. So do not pretend to have the majority. All I meant to say is that the very since you all yourselves accepted that without patriotism slowly converting to nationalism, it will not be destructive. Realize that this motion throws a very straightforward equation that whether patriotism leads to nationalism or not, and the motion says is ultimately and not whether it may or not.
Archer, you
So
have
it's a
crossed
very
your time
straightforward
bar.
equation, and you yourself stated it's non-commutative, and everyone patriotic may not be nationalistic. So the equation fails at the end of the day.
Right. Judges, did you get that answer?
Yeah.
Also note that Moitro crossed his time bar by 8 seconds. Now, now we will look forward to a question from the judges if they have one.
Yeah, let's take a minute, guys. Let's take a minute. I think we've had a lot of speaking. Do you
All
guys
right.
mind taking a minute?
All right. All right. So now we have the judges' question to the house. Each speaker has 90 seconds to answer this question for the judges to mark on. And yeah, over to Soham, who has the question.
So the question for the house today is, in a world of unequal resources and unequal power differentials, what kind of conflict constitutes a good or bad conflict? And when does something qualify as detrimental to international relations? We'll be sending it over on the chat. Do you want me to repeat it also? I can just send it on the chat.
Right.
Yeah, repeat it once.
Soham, can you repeat the answer for the house?
Then the chat.
Yeah, in a world of unequal resources and unequal power differentials, what kind of conflict constitutes a good or bad conflict, and when does something qualify as detrimental to international relations?
Let's give them 90 seconds on because there are two parts to it. Do you mind if we give them a little more time?
Yeah, they have 90 seconds.
Yeah, let's give
90 seconds,
them.
I guess, is enough.
Clarification regarding any phraseology.
In
Any-
what order will we be answering?
From the reverse order. So
reverse.
The opposite.
yeah, the last speaker was Yash.
Yash.
So we'll go from Yash all the way to the top to Ishan. So
Yeah, Yash to Ishan.
yeah.
All right, I have a question before.
Yeah.
Yeah, so are we supposed to answer this irrespective of our stance like we were in the first round?
Yeah.
This is,
It's just principles.
Yeah.
All right.
Not even.
see,
Right.
I think Soham, one of the things Soham said while deciding the question was that these are terms which came up a lot of times and you guys clashed over. So let us see like where you guys fall.
We're looking for conceptual clarity.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking for.
So we don't have to answer this question keeping stance in our speeches.
No, forget whatever you are not for or against the motion. This is a question. Think of it as an examination
You can't
question.
even think about it as for or against. I think it's very.
That's what I'm saying. It's not a for or against question. This is a question. It's a question that you have to answer.
Right. So I think we should begin now, or should we give the speakers a minute to?
You give them you'll give them 45 seconds to think about it. That's fine.
All right.
Think about it.
And
All right. So Yash, we'll be starting with you. You have 90 seconds on the clock. You may start.
All right, so addressing the first part of the question, a world of unequal resources and unequal power differentials is the very reason that foreign relations and globalization and international trade has become so important in the 21st century world today. And because we have so many nations with such unequal distribution, that is why foreign relations and an international order are important in order to achieve the best possible scenario for everyone in the world. And therefore, moving on, what kind of conflict constitutes a good or bad conflict? In my opinion, a good conflict is something that in the long term establishes the goal of international peace and security, because that is something agreed upon by the world as what some may call the moral greater good. And therefore, any conflict that leads to a greater good that can be resolved in a peaceful way or in the most peaceful possible way would be a good conflict. And what is detrimental to international relations? What we must understand is that if a country decides to sever relations with country X and form new relations with country Y, and assuming that both ties are equally strong and that country X and Y have equal influence, power, or economic capabilities, then that is not detrimental or constructive to international relations at all. That has no net value to international relations in the first place. And therefore, for something to be detrimental to international relations, a country's the view of a country in the international community or the country's stance with respect to international relations has to go from good to bad. So the outcome of the conflict or the conflict of interest between two countries has to lead to a situation
Yash, wrap
where
up.
the country in question is in a worse position than it was in the beginning for it to be detrimental to international relations.
Right. Thank you, Yash. I hope the judges heard it. And with that, we'll now be moving on to. Is there a question? All right. Okay. Right. So with that, we'll be moving on to Yash's teammate Pranav for his statement on the question proposed. Pranav, your time starts. Are you ready? Right. Your time starts.
Right. I'd like to point out something very important to this house before I address the first part of the question. So the thing is, the laws of sociology very clearly explain to us that there is no such thing as a good conflict. A conflict, first of all, is not a continuous process, but it is a fundamental process. And secondly, a conflict is inherently of a damaging nature. There is no such thing as a good conflict. So according to what science has evolved over the last few years, last many years, I'd say there is no such thing as a good conflict. What can be said is, in very very rare cases, there may be some kind of offshoot that is that might have a positive effect on the particular party involved, which is a very 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 rare instance. And that you could say that the offshoot is positive, but conflict in itself is never of a positive nature. So now I'd like to address this. The positive idea here is competition. Now the second idea I'd like to address is the fact that what is detrimental to international relations and what is not. Now, when you talk about what is detrimental, the key aspect here is the fact that we're using the word detrimental. If it was destructive has the word terminal in it, and detrimental does not. Detrimental would simply mean this causes harm to it. When you're discussing what may or may not cause harm to international relations, I think it would be most logical to assess it from a point of net value. Every country has priority to relations with particular countries over others. When you take in any action of theirs into account, I think it is for each country for themselves to assess, is
Can I
this
wrap up?
is it detrimental to my international relations or not, given that I have priorities in place with separate countries. Thank you.
All right. With that, we're going to move on to the next team, starting with Avet Ulsian.
Yeah.
Avet, are you ready?
Yeah.
You have 90 seconds on the clock. The floor is yours.
So the point I'd like to make is that the very concept of conflict, as Pranav said before, cannot be good as an overall concept. The result of a conflict may be good for one of the parties involved, or for more than one parties involved, and bad for some of the others. Furthermore, when we're looking at what qualifies as detrimental to international relations, we can't looking at a conflict overall. Can you hear me?
Right.
Repeat.
Judges, can we ask him to repeat the?
Yeah. I couldn't hear anything.
Avet,
Start from the beginning.
yeah, please do. You have your time is reset. Okay. Your time starts now.
So my point is that, similar to what Pranav said, the overall concept of a conflict can never be inherently good or good as a whole for the world. It may be good for one or more of the parties involved and bad for one or more of the other parties involved. But overall, the concept of a conflict can never be good. And when it comes to determining whether something is detrimental to international relations or not, the very presence
I think we can give him a speech later.
Yeah.
conflict over a conflict kind of how
Avet, I don't think we couldn't really hear your speech.
okay,
So, can you, while we go through the other statements, can you just retry, just like try to stabilize your internet connection, and we'll come back to you at the end.
Yeah, he'll just speak later. You'll just speak
Yeah,
later. Chill.
exactly. Yeah. All right. So we'll move to the next one, which is his teammate Shinjoy. A minute and 30 seconds.
Right.
Are you ready?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Uh, right. So, according to me, the criterion by which we can judge whether a conflict is a good conflict or a bad conflict is whether or not that particular conflict has led to social change or social progress in any form. For example, the apartheid movement. Uh, this is a conflict because understand, ladies and gentlemen, that always conflicts need not be military in nature. The abolition of slavery, it it had led to a civil war in America, but eventually what happened was it led to social progress. So according to me, when in hindsight we evaluate whether a conflict is in nature a good conflict or a bad conflict, the way to evaluate that is by checking whether it has led to social progress and social change or not. Secondly, what
Shinjoy,
is right. So, what is detrimental to international relations and what is detrimental to a country's interests are two very different things. Even a worsening of relations with an enemy country is detrimental to international relations, but not necessarily. Not every not everything that is detrimental to international relations is detrimental to a
Shinjoy, wrap
country's
up.
interests, and therefore the countries may adopt such a stance that might be detrimental to the relations with a particular country. It does not always have to imply that it will be detrimental to the country's interests on an economic or political level.
All right. Note that Shinjoy has judges note that Shinjoy has greatly passed his time bar. Uh, and with that, we'll be moving on to the next team, the Quadrant Queens, as they call themselves. We'll be starting with Riddhi. Riddhi, are you ready?
Yeah,
Yes.
thanks.
Go.
I want to start by saying that I don't want to argue this on statistical basis because I think it's more of a philosophical question. If we're talking about good and bad conflicts, as people have said before, conflicts can be damaging. However, I don't believe that every conflict needs to be a war because public discourse, debate, dialogue between countries and also within groups within a country are also and can also lead to conflict. Examples given were like the civil rights movement, the apartheid movement. Almost every time social change comes into consideration, every time an oppressed group stands up for itself, that is a kind of conflict of interest between status quo and the oppressed group. Therefore, we understand that in case when conflict is not war, conflict can be productive and that can be called a good conflict. If we're talking about a war, I don't believe that any kind of war or military conflict can be positive because it leads to large scale loss of life and also has economic as well as psychological impacts on both the people of the country and between the foreign relations of country. So no, war cannot be good. War and wartime conflict is always bad, but social change, social dialogue, and change in status quo is can be a form of conflict which is positive. Coming to the second part of the question, which is why it's detrimental to the world of IR. I think again we have to look at this from two perspectives, right? We have to look at this from whether it's detrimental to the global international community or whether it is detrimental to the country in question.
Riddhi, wrap
So,
up.
right. So, my contention here is that conflict can be positive for one country in a situation like the USA in the Middle East, but it can also be detrimental for other countries involved in that situation. Thanks.
All right. Now, with that, I'd just like to mention that Srinjoy has to leave now for because he has prior commitments, but he is done with his speeches and has given everything he could to give the judges to know. Thank you for joining, Srinjoy, and the results will be declared with given to you once they're out.
Really sorry for the inconvenience, guys. Like,
Not a problem. Thank you, Shinjoy. And yeah, goodbye. On that note, we will now we will now move on to the next speaker, which is Riddhi's teammate Kamal Kohli. Kamal Kohli, are you ready? Kamal Kohli, your mic. Right.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, now you are. Kamal Kohli, you have a minute and 30 seconds on the clock. The floor is yours.
Right. So to understand and answer this question, what we have to first realize is that nothing is black and white in the world of international relations. And so when we look at conflicts, conflict as a word in general has a negative connotation attached to it. But unlike what Pranav said, conflict does not necessarily always mean something bad. In fact, conflict can be good, especially when it increases positive output, when it stops groupthink, and in these cases, there is something called a good conflict. So to distinguish between a good and bad conflict, what we have to realize that you can only understand if something is a good conflict if it finally gives out a net positive output. And now, how do we understand when something qualifies as detrimental to international relations? We understand that something is detrimental to international relations, whether it's an action or a commitment, through its net negative output. So today, if an action by one country is hampering the peace, harmony, and cooperation of all other countries in the international order, then that is something which will qualify as detrimental to international relations. Thus, it is very clear how we qualify something as detrimental to international relations. It is when it affects peace, harmony, and proper relations between countries in the international order, where we are involved in international treaties and international organizations. So when the workings of those are hampered, when there is hostility between countries, those actions qualify as detrimental to international relations. Thank you.
All right. With a pinpoint ending, we will now end the speeches with the team that started it off, the obnoxious male debaters. My personal favorite name, if I may. We will be starting with Moitro, who is Moitro. Moitro, are you ready?
Yeah.
Right. Moitro, you have 1 minute and 30 seconds on the clock. Your time starts now.
Yeah. So just like a debate progresses with disagreement, I believe that everything progresses with conflict as well. So I believe that every conflict is good at a macroscopic level, and in cases, in very exceptional cases like let's say the world wars, the very microscopic, which is oppression or death of armament, the microscopic outweighs the macroscopic, and it changes. And there my stance does not stand. But in majority of the cases, in fact, whilst the others were speaking, I actually googled up pros of the Middle Eastern conflict over the years, and there was actually a on it with a lot of points. Ideas, nothing with till now Vietnam War or the South China Sea dispute has always had some of the other good effects from one perspective and bad from the other. But at the end of the day, as I said, it essentially shapes up the current juncture, the present. And secondly, what is detrimental to IR? I believe that let's say in a classroom, it can never be the students who are detrimental to negatively or positively detrimental to the lesson. If there's one student creating discrepancies, it is short term and he can be removed, but it's the teacher. So similarly, I believe that if the international organization is corrupted, if the international organization is there is no consensus with the international organization, and that is compromised, international organization, IR is actually negatively affected. Apart from that, I don't know that.
Yeah. Thank you, Moitro. Judges, because of the little static in his during his speech, were you able to get what he said? Right. With that, I think we'll move on to his teammate, Ishan Sengupta. Ishan, are you ready?
Yes.
Right.
So when we talk about a conflict, I think first of all, I must say conflicts are inevitable. And secondly, I think a good conflict should be like a good debate. All the countries at the table should have the chance to freely express their own interests. These interests should be allowed to transparently, freely, and fairly interplay with each other so that the actual outcome accurately expresses all the countries' interests properly. So this is what a good conflict is, and a bad conflict for me will be any conflict where there is control over the debate, where the mediation takes place not freely, not transparently, where there is behind closed doors expression of interest. That for me is a bad conflict, and the other one is a good conflict. And I must say here that unlike what other people have said, not all conflicts are bad. Conflicts are inevitable, because at any table, if more than one person have different interests, there is going to be a conflict. Now, as for IR detrimental effects, I think the aim of good IR should be to increase the pool of countries at the table engaging in good conflicts. So there will be a detrimental effect if A, good conflict is not done, if there is bad conflict. And secondly, if the pool of countries at the table is decreasing, either because countries are not being allowed in the table, say for example Cuba, or because countries are exiting from the table because at frustration with the way the conflict is being mediated. That for me is something which will be detrimental to overall IR.
All right, that's it. With that, I think we've come to the end of.
I have.
Yes, yes. We've come to the end of the obnoxious male debaters' statements. We'll now move on to Ave, who had his statement remaining. Ave, you have the floor for a minute and 30 seconds.
Once. Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes.
All right. So I'd like to begin by saying that in a world of unequal resources and unequal power differentials, it is to be expected that the different nations, due to their different interests and different requirements and different wants, will have conflicts between each other, and that conflicts overall, although they are generally viewed in a negative way, I think to determine whether a conflict constitutes a good or a bad conflict, we need to look at the results of the conflict. If the results, the social changes, political changes, economic changes which came about as a result of that conflict outweigh the negative aspects which are there to every conflict present, whether it be the military deaths or the detriment to the international relations or whatever it may be, if that trade-off is worth it, if that trade-off, if the social progress or whatever progress is being made is worth the detrimental effects, then of course it can be considered a good conflict. And when we're looking at something, and when we're discussing whether something qualifies as detrimental to international relations, what we must understand is that almost every conflict will invariably cause an increase in international relations between, for some countries, and a decrease in the quality of international relations for some other countries. Some countries, as a result of a conflict, will become more closely knit together, while other countries will will move further away from the center of
Ave, wrap up.
and when we are determining whether something was detrimental or not, we need to see which one is more, whether there are more people moving forward towards the center.
All right.
The globe is becoming a more tightly knit community.
That's it, Ave. All right. I think the judges have heard what they've had to hear, and yeah, I think we'll return when the judges have come to have tabulated their results and have come to a decision on the best speakers and the best teams of this debate. All right, now we have the results with us. Thank you, Indrajit. Thank you, Soham. Is there anything you'd like to say to the gathering before we declare the results?
They were supposed to say while you were tabulating.
Yeah, they said things
That
more.
time is gone.
Great speeches, guys. Well done. Amazing job. Hope to do this again soon. If you guys want any feedback, we can talk about it after this.
All right, Soham.
Yeah, I think I had a fun time. I think everybody came in with quite some spirited arguments. It was fun watching all of you guys. Yeah.
All right. With that, I think to skip any other jibber jabber, we'll go straight to the results. We'll start with the first, second, and third best speakers. In third is Shinjoy Sen. Well, congratulations to him. Well done. In second, we have Komal Kohli. Congratulations. And my favorite team name comes in at first. Ishan Sen Gupta secures the first place. The obnoxious male debater. Congratulations to you. Well
Have
done.
Have we lived up to our name?
That is something.
Gave the name.
100%.
I'm just very annoyed how you guys are getting praised for the name, and I gave it.
Right, Komal Kohli has taken credit for this name because apparently she
Some
is.
more female labor that was stolen.
I will not take note of that statement. Anyway, we will now, and yeah, congratulations, you guys. You all did really well. And yeah, we'll move on to the teams now. Again, something I've always liked to reiterate since I've heard it a few days back from Yash. Your skill at the art isn't represented by the number of by only one debate. But anyway, in third position we have Srinjoy and Ave. Congratulations, well done. In second place we have Komal Kohli and Riddhi. Very well done to them. And in first place, again, my favorite team name, the obnoxious male debaters, represented by Ishan Sen Gupta and Moitreya Das. Well done to all of you.
Well
And
done, guys.
Congratulations, everyone.
It's been
It was
a
nice.
Congratulations.
it's been a pleasure hosting this debate for you all.
Yes.
I will be having
Yes.
more over the next month or so. I hope you can join us. And yes, even the judges, thank you for coming in and giving us your valuable time. And yeah, I think all that's left to say is that's what that was, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. Bye.